friends, welcome to my channel 5 Minutes History. Today I bring you the story of Iran-Iraq War, one of the bloodiest conflict in the Middle East and the longest running interstate war of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War lasted for 8 years from September 1980 to August 1988 and tremendously changed the geopolitical situation in the Middle East. In the late 1960s, when the United Kingdom decided to withdraw from the Persian Gulf, the long-standing territorial disputes between Iran and Iraq were reignited. Facing instability at home and increased interference from Iran, the Ba'ath Party regime in Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, conceded some of the country's territorial claims in 1975 agreement with Iran, including the strategic waterway of Shatt al-Arab, formed by the confluence of Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which saw the US-backed Shah of Iran toppled by Islamic fundamentalists, brought the 1975 agreement into question. Leaders of Iran's Islamic Republic indicated their desire to export the revolution's concept of Islamic governance guided by Shiite clergy into Iraq as well. Ayatollah Khomeini, the ideological architect of the revolution, had already found an audience for his ideas in Iraq, which had a majority Shia population but was ruled by Sunni Muslims, led by a secular Ba'athist government. Skirmishes soon erupted along the strategic Shatt al-Arab waterway, while the signs of Iranian interference in Iraq were pronounced. Finally, in September 1980, Saddam ordered an all-out invasion of Iran to prevent Khomeini from exporting the new Iranian ideology to Iraq and to replace Iran as the power player in the Persian Gulf. Although Iran had roughly 3 times the land and population of Iraq, its military was almost half of that of Iraq's Soviet-equipped army. But what it lacked in numbers, Iran made up for with religious zeal. Iran's army in 1982 was described as a curious military force of professional soldiers, neighborhood militiamen, mullahs, and schoolboys as young as 13, linked by an intense Islamic fervor. Iran also enjoyed one considerable advantage over Iraq. As a one-time ally of Washington and the West, it had hundreds of top-of-the-line US-built fighter jets, including the latest F-14 Tomcats. Saddam's generals gambled that a preemptive surprise attack on Iran's airfields in the opening minutes of the hostilities would catch these formidable warplanes on the tarmac. So on September 22, 1980, squadrons of Iraqi MiG-23, Su-20 and Tu-22 bombers penetrated Iranian airspace and attacked a dozen air bases across the country. The airstrikes were followed by a 3-pronged ground attack by the Iraqi army along a 400-mile front. The objective was to seize vast areas of western Iran, which it had hoped would precipitate the downfall of the Khomeini regime. Despite catching the Iranian Air Force completely off guard, the air raids inflicted only light damages in Iran. In fact, many of the prized American-built warplanes were safe inside concrete bunkers at the time of the attack. Iran quickly launched the counter-offensive, and just a day after the Iraqi raids, 160 Iranian F-4 Phantoms and F-5 Tigers bombed 11 airfields inside Iraq, including the Baghdad International Airport. The attack, codenamed Operation Kaman, was devastating. A number of major Iraqi runways were put out of the action for months, and according to some estimates, the capability of Saddam's air force was cut by nearly half. Iraqi ground forces, who had pushed miles into the Iranian province of Khuzestan, also faced stiff resistance, and within weeks their advance was stalled. The fighting soon bogged down into a deadly stalemate, and the conflict morphed into a bloody high-tech rerun of the First World War's Western Front. Trenches, barbed wires, machine gun nests divided the opposing armies as both sides dug in rather than expose their troops to enemy fire. Pitched and bloody battles were fought in places like Desful, Khurramshahr, Alfa and Mehran, with bayonet charges, massed artillery bombardments, and even poison gas attacks, and caused massive human casualties on both sides. Unable to match Iraq's large Soviet-equipped army, Iran planned to overwhelm the invaders with human wave attacks. These typically involved large-scale frontal assaults on enemy positions by small groups of paramilitary volunteers. Once the teams had blown open gaps in the enemy defenses, fresh reinforcements from the professional army were rushed forward to exploit the breaches. Even though they suffered massive casualties, the Iranian military began to gain momentum against the Iraqis and regained virtually all lost territory by June 1982. After pushing Iraqi forces back to the pre-war borderlines, Iran even rejected Saddam's calls for a ceasefire and launched an invasion of Iraq that lasted for the next 5 years. Its victorious army surrounded the city of Basra in Iraq, what would become one of the largest land battles since the Second World War. With the tide turning against him, Saddam sought to force Tehran to the peace table with a terror campaign targeted against Iranian civilians. Iraqi warplanes shot down civilian jetliners, strafed passenger trains, and ordered missile attacks on more than 60 Iranian population centers in what would become known as the War of the Cities. Saddam also launched an offensive against the rebellious Kurds in the northern Iraq, in which thousands of ethnic Kurds were massacred. With no end to the war in sight, the two countries began attacking each other's oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. Iran also attacked tankers headed to and from Kuwait and other Gulf states, prompting the United States and several European powers to station warships in the Persian Gulf to ensure the flow of oil to the rest of the world. By the spring of 1988, both sides were exhausted politically, economically, and militarily. On the front lines, Iran had suffered an epic defeat at the gates of Iraqi city of Basra. Meanwhile, at home, sanctions were strangling the country's economy. Iran's army was all but out of volunteers, and desertions were up. Iraq was in somewhat better shape, but it was still buckling under the strain of an 8-year-long campaign that was costing its treasury billions of dollars every month. Enemy troops were dug in on Iraqi soil, and Baghdad faced an ongoing Kurdish insurgency within its own borders. In mid-1988, Saddam gambled again and threatened Iran with a new and powerful full-scale invasion and use of chemical weapons on its cities, hoping that it will force Iran to the negotiating table. Shortly afterwards, Iraqi aircrafts bombed the Iranian town of Osnawi with poison gas, killing over 2,000 civilians. On 3rd July 1988, a US warship shot down Iranian passenger jet, killing around 290 people. During this time, international community remained tight-lipped. The lack of international sympathy disturbed the Iranian leadership, and they came to the conclusion that the United States was on the verge of waging a full-scale invasion of Iran, and that Iraq was on the verge of unleashing its entire chemical arsenal upon their cities. As such, on 20th July 1988, Iran finally accepted the United Nations brokered ceasefire, which called on both sides to suspend hostilities and withdraw to pre-war boundaries. Sporadic clashes continued for weeks after the ceasefire, but eventually both sides suspended hostilities by 20th August 1988. The Iran-Iraq War was the deadliest conventional war ever fought between the regular armies of the developing countries. An estimated 500,000 people were killed on both sides, with Iran suffering the greater losses. Lakhs of civilians too were killed and wounded. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 1 lakh Kurds were killed by Iraqi forces during the war. Iran was militarily depleted, economically bankrupt, and politically isolated. Yet the regime had succeeded in driving the invaders from its soil and survived the war. In contrast, Iraq emerged from the conflict with more power in the region than it had before, but was burdened with more than $130 billion of international debt and was also weighed down by a slowed GDP growth. Iraq also lost much of the support from international community due to the indiscriminate use of the chemical weapons and its brutal suppression of the Kurds.